At Ole Guitar asks, how do you do a perfect balance in the mix? And at Brandon Blurts asks a variation on that, how do you know when your mix is balanced? So we get this question a lot, which is some variation of how do I know when my mix is balanced? And it's an incredibly broad topic that essentially is mixing itself. Mixing, like the entire craft of mixing is about balancing things. So a few things to start off, knowing your monitoring. That's essential. Making sure that you're listening on as neutral a system as you possibly can, and that includes the room. Making sure your room is treated as well as you can possibly do it. Get the best monitors you can. If you need to work on headphones, get the best headphones you can. And then on top of that, get to know them. So this is where I find references comes in really handy. Not for the sake of trying to imitate the reference. So if you're working in a genre, say rock or trap, find really good examples of those tracks, commercially released tracks. Listen to them and compare your mixes to theirs, but not with the goal of having your vocals sound like their vocals or having your kick drum sound like their kick drum. More to orient yourself, like listen to their high frequencies, their low frequencies, their mid-range, how is everything in proportion to each other? And that can help you kind of just orient yourself around your system. You get to know what things are supposed to sound like on your system. And if the professional mixes sound a little bit muddy and a little bit dull, then you know that you should probably tend your mixes towards there. Even if they might sound better to you, taking them in the opposite direction, like making them a little bit brighter and a little bit punchier, a little bit more scoop. Essentially, when you're doing that, you're compensating for things that are not in the music, but things that are in your monitoring environment. And once you leave that monitoring environment, that all ceases to have an impact. Like your mix kind of falls apart. So something that sounds really balanced in your monitoring environment would probably sound too bright and too harsh and too thin once you take it out. So using professional mixes to orient yourself, I think, is a good way of making do with a less than perfect monitoring environment. It helps you to get to know it, much more quickly than just going trial and error and having mix after mix fail in the real world. That said, while professional mixes can kind of get you in the ballpark, there's a pretty wide range of what sounds good. You have to go pretty far, I find, to have something that objectively is like way too bright or objectively is way too muddy or bad sounding. So there's no such thing as a perfect balance. There's a range in which things sound good, and you should kind of use that to your advantage and let the music dictate how to balance things in the best way possible. Like if the music wants a bit more of an intimate feel, you'll want to push the low mids, you'll want to roll off some highs, you'll want to balance instruments in a way that certain things are forward, certain things fall back. If the music is very lively and energetic, you might do the opposite. You might cut some mids, you might brighten it up. What makes sense for one song, the balance that makes sense for one song, one approach won't make sense when applied to another. So there's no universal balance where everything's just gonna fit. So those are my general tips on the subject. But now I'd like to explore possibly a little bit more of an esoteric approach, something a little left of center, which I find is kind of the underpinning. It's like a global concept that sort of underpins the idea of what makes a mix balanced or sound good. And that is the idea of movement. There tends to be this idea that finding a perfect balance means finding a level to set your faders where you don't have to move them. They just sit there and everything's perfect. And I would argue that that's kind of the antithesis to me of a perfect mix. If things are too static, the human brain tends to reject or come to ignore something that doesn't change over time. So if you have drums that just kind of truck along at a certain level, they become much more easy to ignore. Same with arrangement elements. If things just stay the same level, if nothing moves forward and then moves back, after a while, your mix might start off sounding really good, but after a while it just becomes ignorable because nothing is sort of re-triggering the listener's attention. To me, balance is interplay. That's sort of movement that comes with instruments playing off each other. So if you think about a band playing live, like musicians in a room all playing together, when one person steps up to play a lead, the others kind of back off a little bit, and it's subtle. It's, you know, they're not dropping the level 20 dB, but it's that constant sort of fluctuation of things that give that sense of relief to a mix, and your ear kind of tunes into that. And ultimately that creates like a more interesting thing to listen to, which I think is the goal of a balance. Another thing to add movement is effects. If you think about a Hammond organ, it's really hard to think of a Hammond without thinking of the Leslie speaker as well, because a Hammond on its own is pretty static, pretty boring. Throw a Leslie in there and you've got all that swirling movement, and it immediately goes from something your ear can just tune out to, in my opinion, one of the more beautiful musical sounds that exists. Another way to do it is through arrangement. Picture your workstation screen. You know, if everything is just arranged in like, here's your verse, and you've got blocks of 16 bars, everything playing, and then it goes to the chorus and everything playing, that's another way that a mix can be very static. To me, having elements come and also leave, that's important. It's not, you know, arranging is not just piling more and more elements on top of things. It's trading things off. One instrument will trade off to another instrument, but then that first instrument leaves. It just gets out of the way. Doesn't mean they can't come back in, but there's this constant back and forth. All those different ways of injecting movement into your mix, I think inherently leads to a more cohesive musical expression, which is the goal of the mix. So rather than thinking about balance as this sort of absolute goal that you attain and then you can just coast it out to the end of the song, think about balance as constantly maintaining the listener's interest, constantly presenting and even amplifying the musical intention of any given moment. And once you do that across the song, it makes one for a much more enjoyable, effortless listen for the audience. But you'll also find that you constantly have to unbalance and rebalance things in order to actually achieve balance. And that's my Zen moment of the day. Hey everyone, I'm Al Easler, Senior Audio Engineer here at LANDR. If you like this video or any of the other videos on this channel, consider liking and subscribing. If you need help with your mix, leave a question or comment below, and either myself or one of our other audio engineers will answer it. Thanks for watching.